Let me ask you something. Have you ever run out of gas before? Because whether it's today or back in the 90s, that's not something most people would consider dangerous. It's inconvenient, frustrating, maybe even a little embarrassing, but not a nightmare. Not something you think could change your life or end it. And in most cases, it doesn't. You figure it out, you get help, you move on. But in this case, it became a defining moment that changed everything. Sometimes it's not the situation itself that's dangerous, it's who shows up in it. So let me ask you this. Have you ever accepted help from someone just because it felt safe in the moment? Not because you knew them or even trusted them, but because everything about them looked like you could? This case is a chilling example of how something as normal as routine can be weaponized against you. This is the case of Dawnia DaCosta. Our case takes us to Broward County, Florida, 8 years before everything happened. Dawnia DaCosta moved to the United States with her mother, Daphne, and her 4 siblings. They moved from Jamaica to afford themselves better opportunities. Now, it was said that Dawnia moved to the United States between the ages of 10 to 12. Dawnia was born December 1st, 1978, in Jamaica. And by the time she made it to Florida, she was already beginning to build a life she fully intended to see through. By 21, she had plans. She wanted to get married, start a family, raise her children, and most of all, become a pediatric nurse. And she was already on the path of her career. She was especially close to her family, but especially her older sister, Rochelle. They were said to do everything together. When you see Rochelle, you see Dawnia. And when you saw Dawnia, you saw Rochelle. They were definitely two peas in a pod. And together, they attended Faith Tabernacle Church. But for them, church wasn't just about religion, it was community, it was structure, and safety. So although she was 21, she would spend her extracurricular time down at the church. On Friday, December 4th, 1998, she had just celebrated her 21st birthday, and instead of going to a party or to the club, she decided that she, alongside her sister, would attend a prayer vigil at their church. Rochelle was planning to go with her sister, but it said that either she had to go to work or she had schoolwork that she had to take care of. So that meant Dawnia would go by herself, and she still planned to attend alone. But something I want you guys to know is that their mother, Daphne, didn't always like them going to these prayer vigils. Now, don't get me wrong, she had no qualms with her children attending prayer service. I mean, this is every mother's dream. Your child, right after celebrating their 21st birthday, is wanting to go to church and pray. So she didn't want to stand in front of that, but really for her, it was a matter of safety. You see, these prayer services would last all the way until about 12:30 a.m., 1 o'clock, when the club would normally get out, and her girls would have to drive home after. And she was always concerned about their safety, asking them if they could leave a little early, just so they could get home in a good amount of time when things would appear to be safer outside. Her girls would always reassure her, no, mom, we'll be safe. And although she felt a sense of uneasiness, knowing that they were together brought her some comfort. However, when she found out that Dawnia would be going to this prayer service on her own, she was even more on edge. But Dawnia and Rochelle both assured their mother that everything would be just fine. During these times when mothers have instincts, they know that they should truly follow them. I think that's why Daphne kept bringing it up. She kept talking about it because she really felt on a guttural level that something was wrong. And a lot of times people try to knock these instincts off as random, but they're not. They're cautionary. Dawnia goes to the prayer service, and Rochelle goes off to work or does her own schoolwork and eventually comes back home. And that evening, Daphne waits up for her daughter. I mean, she goes to bed, but she's awaiting her daughter to come in at any moment. And around 1 a.m., she wakes up and goes to Dawnia's room and she doesn't see her there. Feeling something is off, she goes and wakes up Rochelle and asks her where Dawnia was, if she heard from her. And Rochelle simply tells her mother that Dawnia more than likely got out of prayer service and decided to go over a friend's house and she would be home by sunrise. Don't worry about it, go back to bed. But Daphne didn't feel comfortable. She fought herself and she got a restless night of sleep. When sunrise finally came, Danya still wasn't there. And Daphne knew that something wasn't right and something happened to her youngest daughter because it was not like Danya to not communicate with her. Now Rochelle is disheveled like her mother. She now is assured that something did go wrong because this is not like Danya. Daphne and Rochelle gathered themselves together and they decided to go back down to the church. They initially thought maybe she spent the night at the church. And while that sounds a little odd, the way that Danya loved church, that wouldn't be too crazy for her to decide to spend the night there. Plus, they really just wanted to see what information they could get from members at the church. And when they questioned some of the parishioners, they said, well, yeah, we saw Danya last night at church services, but when we were released, we no longer saw her. The next thing that Daphne and Rochelle did was to check Danya's job. She worked at American Express and she had a shift on Saturday and she didn't show up for her shift. Danya was responsible. If you can't get that feel by now, she was put together. You could set your clock by Danya's schedule. If she said she was going to do something, she would do it. And if she said she was going to be somewhere, that's where she was going to be. And she always communicated with her mother. So this was unusual. And she wouldn't just vanish without telling anyone. Daphne and Rochelle decided to get together with friends and family and print off flyers and start passing them out in the community. But Daphne didn't stop there. She was committed to finding out where her daughter went. When she left the church, she decided to retrace the path that she would take to go back home. And at a particular point in this navigation, she got off at an exit that Danya would have taken. This exit was about a half a mile away from where Danya and Daphne and her other siblings lived. She saw parked on the side of this exit Danya's car with the hazard lights on. Danya drove a 1974 LTD, and her mother started to feel a sense of relief as she parked her car because she knew Danya had issues with her transmission. Perhaps Danya decided to spend the night in her car waiting to get help until daylight. But when she walked over to Danya's car, Danya was nowhere to be found and her car was empty. The only thing left in her car was a blanket in the back seat. Now, what's even more haunting in this story is that from the exit, it was only a 10-minute walk from where Danya's car was left. The question becomes, what happened to Danya? If she was having car trouble, why wouldn't she just walk home if it was 10 minutes away? Daphne knew that feeling that she had all along was backed up by her daughter's abandoned car on the side of the road. And with the support of her friends and family that gathered with her the entire day to search for Danya, they decided to go to the Broward County Police Department and file a missing persons report. Now, we all know that sometimes police departments can drag their feet, especially when it comes to missing women of color. However, that wasn't the case here. Police got involved quickly, mainly because they were able to substantiate that this was not Danya's usual behavior. She was, for all intensive purposes, virtually a saint. She was responsible, always communicating with her friends and family. She would communicate to everybody that she knew, and she never would voluntarily go missing. So for her to leave a church event and not call anyone, not say anything to anyone, implied to police that they needed to get involved and find her. As we know, in missing person cases, the more time goes by without any communication from the missing, the more it is believed that they are no longer alive. They were racing against a clock that had already started. One of the first things they did was take a look inside of Dawnia's car, but they didn't find anything substantial. But there was one detail. You remember I said her mother revealed that she had transmission problems? Well, according to police, when they analyzed the vehicle, there wasn't anything wrong with the transmission. The car simply ran out of gas. So her mother told investigators that she usually kept a gas container in the trunk. And when they looked inside the trunk, the gas container was gone. And they put two and two together and they recognized there was a gas station less than a mile away. They went to that gas station and talked to the attendant, and he described what Dawnia was wearing. She was wearing a floral dress, and they showed him a picture, and the gas attendant confirmed that it was Dawnia and that she purchased $1.76 worth of gas. And you guys, I wouldn't be stiff if I didn't say, my goodness, can we go back to the 90s? Because gas prices are out of control. The fact that she even got $1.76 worth and she felt like that was enough to get her to the house. Y'all know that ain't getting us nowhere today. I know you know it ain't getting us nowhere. Do you hear me? But let's get back to our story. They went back and looked at Dawnia's credit card and they found the receipt. They had proof that Dawnia was at the gas station, that she did purchase gas, and the gas station clerk saw her. They could confirm she was there. But while this lead was good, they had no other witnesses that came forward to substantiate where she could have gone between the gas station and not returning back to her car. Investigators had to turn to the public, and her story gained local attention. Investigators were dependent on the public to come forward and give them the information they needed to really get more answers from this case. They wanted to bring Dawnia home. That was their objective. 8 hours later, two witnesses do come forward and they say they saw Dawnia at the gas station where she purchased the gas. They walked detectives through everything they saw. It was a play-by-play. They saw her purchasing the gas, coming out, filling the gas container. While she was filling up the container, they claimed that a church van pulled up behind her. Now, inside the van, they were able to describe a black man who was clean-cut and he had a mustache. And they said he spoke to her, offering her a ride back to her car. And this is where things get a little frustrating with the two witnesses' accounts, although they helped a lot, because their account deferred on a major detail that comes to be critical in the investigation. Now, one of the witnesses said, yes, they saw this church van, but the church van had the word hope on the side of it. And the other witness said they didn't see any words at all. They just saw a generic cross. It was different. Did it have words on it? Did it not? And this really didn't point them into a direction of where to look for this church van, which was the last vehicle that they saw Dawnia in. However, this tip that the witnesses gave detectives hope, no pun intended, because it provided them with a missing link of possibly last known location where Dawnia was and who she was with. Now, one of the witnesses was able to get a very good glance on the guy who got out of the church van. So good, in fact, that she was able to work with a sketch artist to come up with a composite sketch of the last known individual that Dawnia was seen with. And so detectives knew that this was good information, and they took that information and began to look. The first church that they looked to see if they had a church van was Faith Tabernacle, where Dawnia attended church. And they found out that the church van that Faith Tabernacle had did not match the description of the two witnesses. So they moved on very quickly, and they realized they would have to zoom out so they could get a better glance at the churches in the area. And so they broadened their search. Now, we know Florida sits in the Bible Belt, so you can imagine there is a church on every corner. So they were having to look very closely at different churches in the area, in the surrounding areas. And honestly, it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But they were committed to finding out who was responsible for Dawnia's disappearance. And as I previously said before, they were hoping that they would be able to bring Dawnia home. Now, detectives initially had the best of intentions. They felt maybe this guy who gave Dawnia a ride dropped her off at a location and something happened from there. They weren't thinking necessarily this was their perpetrator, but they knew that they needed to follow the evidence. Now, as detectives are looking through the myriad of churches in the Broward area and surrounding areas, they receive a phone call 3 days later after Dawnia's initial disappearance. And a warehouse worker found a body near a dumpster. It was a young Black woman in Oakland Park, which was about 20 miles away from the last place Dawnia's car was seen. Detectives were hoping that this was not Dawnia's body, but they went out to look at the body anyway. The victim was wrapped from head to toe. There were sheets that covered the body and garbage bags surrounding it. There was a purple laundry bag over the victim's head, and whoever dumped her, well, they weren't careful. The vehicle ran over her leg, leaving a tire tread mark on the streets. And this was very critical to the investigation. At this time, they didn't know if the victim was Dawnia or not, but they knew they needed to make sure whatever evidence that was found on the body, they preserved it. The medical examiner took the body in and he discovered that the victim had been raped. They recovered semen on the body and the victim suffered 36 stab wounds, and the fatal blow was a stab to the skull, leaving a star-shaped injury. And they were able to determine that the weapon used was a screwdriver, a special screwdriver called a Torx that left behind a star-shaped emblem when used. They didn't have the screwdriver in their possession, but they were able to identify the weapon. According to detectives, they believed that the perpetrator knew the victim. This crime was not quick. The perpetrator took their time and made sure they tortured the victim. And to stab somebody 36 times implied overkill. It was up close, personal, and that a lot of anger was carried out through this crime. The medical examiner placed the time of death about 36 hours earlier around the time that Dawnia disappeared. And eventually, dental records confirmed it was Dawnia DaCosta. And the confirmation that it was Dawnia hit her family in a way that's hard to even put into words. But for her mother, Daphne, I'm sure it was different because she had already felt something wasn't right the night Dawnia went to the prayer vigil. She didn't like the idea of her daughters being out that late, and now she had to sit with that feeling, knowing how everything turned out. And I think that's the part that people don't always talk about, because when you're a parent, your mind doesn't just go to the loss, it goes to the what ifs. What I could have done differently. What if I had insisted that she didn't go out late that night? What if I told her to stay at home? What if I pushed a little harder? And even though there was nothing she could have done to stop what happened, that doesn't stop those thoughts from coming. That doesn't stop the weight from sitting with you. She lost her daughter. Rochelle and her other siblings lost a sister, and they have to carry that too. And I'm sure for Rochelle, who was supposed to go with her that night, that couldn't because she had work or because she had to do some work, that just sits heavily on her chest, just as it does Daphne. I don't want to skip over that. I don't want that loss not to be felt by us who remain. I know that guilt doesn't belong to them at all. That sits entirely with the killer. But it still affects them in ways I'm sure is difficult to move on from today. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. And here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. And Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our feed, but the stories deserve to be told. And you can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back. And this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. Investigators were saddened that they could not reach Dawnia in time to rescue her from the hands of the killer. But investigators started broadening their search. And so one of the first things they did was to re-examine Dawnia's car. And they wondered if she had a relationship with someone. Now, based on everything I've told you about Dawnia, do you believe she had a boyfriend? Well, when investigators asked Dawnia's family, Rochelle and Daphne, they quickly told them no. Dawnia wasn't seeing anybody. As a matter of fact, Dawnia was saving herself for marriage. She was wanting to do things according to her faith, so she wasn't dating anyone, although she did want to get married. Investigators knew they couldn't close themselves off from that theory. And when they re-examined Dawnia's car, inside they found an advertisement for an engagement ring. And so they wondered, was there somebody in the cut that she didn't want anybody else to know about? And did they meet up with her on the night of her disappearance? It was a possibility. And although that sounded far-fetched for Dawnia's family, we know of many cases where people keep secret things and they don't tell their families everything. And so although this seemed off-putting for the family, investigators needed to make sure that they fully vetted this option. However, there was no confirmed partner and no clear suspect. And then a tip came in from a source that was pretty close to the police department. A police officer's girlfriend overheard people talking at the gas station. And it was the same gas station where Dawnia was last seen and picked up by the church van. And one name kept coming up, Walter McKenzie. And the more detectives learned about Walter McKenzie, they learned he drove a church van. And not only did he drive a church van, but he lived 2 blocks away from where Dawnia stayed. Keep in mind that they said whoever murdered Dawnia knew Dawnia. This was a crime of passion. And the fact that he drove a church van, he lived close to Dawnia, and that the families knew each other made investigators believe that they were onto something. Statistically, they say when perpetrators don't know their victim is they don't participate in overkill. So they'll try to kill their victim as quickly as possible. They'll use a gun. And if they do use a knife, they don't stab them more than twice. And in this case, we know there was overkill. They found out that Walter McKenzie had a son named Walter McKenzie Jr. And so they started to look at both of them as suspects. Equipped with this information, detectives didn't do what they traditionally do when they have a suspect, which is to bring in the McKenzie men for interviews and see if they have an alibi. Instead, what they decided to do was to lay back in the cut, and detectives surveilled their residence. Detectives wanted to see if either of the men would take the church van out to Oakland, where they originally found Dawnia's body. However, as days went by, they noticed that the men didn't take it out to Oakland. Instead, they would only take the church van from the church back to the residence where they lived. And detectives didn't know who was driving the van this particular day, but they knew they needed to move in. So they pulled the van over. Inside, they found Walter McKenzie Jr. along with 3 friends. And they pulled them out of the car and asked them, did they have anything to do with Dawnia's murder? All of the men said no and gave alibis for where they were on the morning of Dawnia's murder. According to detectives, Walter McKenzie Jr. was very cooperative, and so were his friends. And so they pushed a little further because they needed to see how far they could get and how much evidence they could gather. So they asked Junior if they could look into his church van, and he willingly says yes. Now, by all accounts, he's cooperative, and most people would say this implies innocence. But just because you cooperate doesn't mean you're innocent. So they had to fully vet Walter McKenzie Jr. and his friends. So they search the vehicle, and in the back seat, they find a duffel bag. According to Walter McKenzie Jr., he doesn't know who that duffel bag belongs to. People leave things behind in the van all the time. Coincidence? Maybe the truth. We don't know. Inside that duffel bag, they find a floral dress. And if you remember, that was the last clothing item that Dawnia was seen wearing. They take that into evidence, and now they have reason to bring Walter McKenzie Jr. down to the station and question him further. The other 3 friends inside the van with him go down to the station as well. So they push a little further. They ask more hard-hitting questions. And he repeats his alibi, and he says that he had nothing to do with Dawnia's murder despite knowing her and despite living very close to her. So detectives ask if they could retrieve a DNA sample from him, and he agrees. And so does his father, Walter McKenzie Sr. Now, I want to review the evidence so far that detectives have for their present suspects. If you remember, I told you about a composite sketch in the early stage of the investigation. One of the witnesses were able to work with a sketch artist, and so they thought they were looking at the killer. They knew Dawnia was murdered, and it had to do with the church van. They felt like this composite sketch was pretty solid. But when investigators compared the composite sketch to Walter McKenzie Jr. and Sr., it didn't match them. And it didn't match any of Junior's friends who were in the van when he was pulled over. So we've learned some things about composite sketches. You remember? I covered the Nicole Smith case. And in that case, the composite sketch wasn't the holy grail, but it was what detectives looked to in the 90s to identify the killer. But they kept hitting dead ends because they kept comparing who they believed the killer to be to this composite sketch. Because although they had DNA evidence, they didn't have anything that matched in the CODIS system. So they were depending on that composite sketch heavily. And in this case, the composite sketch was also used. But based on the evidence, the composite sketch wasn't really helpful. And what this shows us is that the composite sketch is not the holy grail, but it is a tool in a grand scheme of evidence that police are able to pull from. So just think about it. Although the composite sketch didn't match Walter McKenzie Jr. or Sr., that wasn't enough to exclude them. They still had to check their alibis and what they were doing on the morning that Dawnia was killed. They had that floral dress that they needed to check. And they also had the possible suspect's DNA that they needed to compare to the DNA found on Dawnia's body. So all of that evidence works in tandem. Just because one piece of evidence doesn't fit, and the only exclusion here is DNA, because if the DNA fits, then obviously you're guilty. But they have to figure out how all of the evidence either fits or doesn't fit. It all works in tandem. And we're able to see it very clearly in a case like this. Detectives were assured that these were their guys because not only did they have all of this evidence somewhat stacking up against them, but according to the profile of the killer, it seemed like it was them as well. So one of the things that the detective did is while they were waiting on that DNA analysis, the head detective goes to Daphne, Dawnia's mother, and they show her this floral print dress because we know that was the last thing that Dawnia was wearing. And when Daphne sees the dress, she tells detectives that is not the dress that Dawnia was wearing. As a matter of fact, it wasn't the right size. It wasn't the right style of floral print dress. And the detective was shocked because he just knew that either Walter Jr. or Walter Sr. was their guy. But when that DNA came back, they could no longer deny what was in front of them. It didn't match Walter Sr., Jr. Detectives were back at ground zero. Detectives were still working the case. They were still looking into the church van, but that would take them a while. And they were still looking out for any tips that would come in from the media or the community, but everything was starting to slow down. A year later, in March of 1999, detectives were working another case in the field. And they saw a church van that got their attention. This church van didn't seem to belong at this daycare. It almost seemed to be parked there. It didn't seem to be associated with the daycare because the church van had a different name than the daycare. Detectives, thinking back to the first two witnesses in the early stage of the investigation that had two different accounts about the church van, they remembered it. And this church van that was sitting in the parking lot of a daycare had on the side hope. And it's amazing what people remember, but detectives remember it. And this van stuck out like a sore thumb. So they decided to go into the daycare to see if the church van belonged to the daycare or if it was just parked outside and if they knew the owners. When they walked inside, they met the owner of the van and also the owner of the daycare. It was the same man. His name was Reverend Winston Garfield. He told them that the church van was associated with his church, which went by the same name, and also the daycare. Now, very quickly, they decided to look at the composite sketch that the witnesses originally gave. And it didn't match Reverend Winston Garfield either. But as they began to talk to Reverend Garfield, they didn't think that he was the perpetrator. But they needed to see where he was on the morning of Dawnia's death. And he gave them a rock-solid alibi. He gave them receipts and travel receipts because he was out of town during the time of Dawnia's murder. Now, knowing that he wasn't their guy, they had other questions that Reverend Garfield could help them with. And that was, if he wasn't driving his church van during the time of Dawnia's death, who was? And according to his logs, a maintenance worker had borrowed his van on December 4th and didn't return it until Monday, the same Monday that Dawnia's body was found in Oakland Park. That man's name was Lucious Boyd. Now, Lucious Boyd wasn't new to law enforcement. He had been tried multiple times for rape and murder. But each time he was tried, he walked free every time. He was acquitted, and law enforcement called him Teflon Don. If you didn't know, Teflon Don is a nickname used for someone who seems to avoid consequences no matter what they're accused of. Teflon meaning non-stick coating on pans and pots, and Don, which means a powerful figure, often tied to organized crime. And although he wasn't tied to organized crime, he was for sure a criminal. Now, his nickname out in the streets was Lucifer because of how evil he truly was, disguising himself as an angel of light when he truly was a monster. The Reverend mentioned that he was missing several items from his truck when it was returned. He said that he was missing a laundry bag, and he also said that he was missing tools. And the one that he knew for sure was missing was a screwdriver, a Torx screwdriver with a star-shaped tip at the bottom. So let me remind you, on Dawnia's head, they found a purple laundry bag, the same laundry bag that Reverend Garfield said was missing, and that screwdriver, the Torx screwdriver that I told you about early on in the investigation that the medical examiner was able to identify that was responsible for leaving that fatal wound on Dawnia's head. Investigators knew that Lucious was their guy, but they still were collecting all the evidence. Remember, they're dealing with the Teflon Don, a guy who went to trial every time but was acquitted. So they needed to make sure that all the evidence they brought to the prosecutor would guarantee a conviction once he went to trial. But all the evidence was lining up, and they knew they had their guy. Remember I told you that Donna's killer wasn't careful because he ran over her body with his vehicle. So they went out to Reverend Garfield's church van. They looked on the tread of the tire, and they matched it with the tread that was found on the sheets she was wrapped in. It was a match. The last piece of evidence that they needed to connect Lucious to Dawnia's murder was the DNA evidence. And they had Lucious's DNA on file because of a rape case. They compared his DNA to the DNA found on Dawnia's body. and they confirmed that it was indeed a match. The murderer was Lucious Boyd. On March 26, 1999, Lucious Boyd was arrested. They sat him down in the interview room and they showed him a picture of Dawnia DaCosta. He claimed he never saw her. Then he changed the story and said, "Oh, yeah, I saw her when I was riding by a gas station." When they confronted him with his DNA evidence, he got frustrated and said, "Well, if you have the evidence, then you have it." And he refused to say anything else. He never confessed, but investigators believe they know exactly what happened. They claim that on the evening of December 4th, 1998, he got into an argument with his girlfriend. So he went out for a night on the town seeking revenge. And that's when he saw Donna at the gas station, vulnerable, and he approached her. He knew that because he was in a church van, it made him look safe. So he offered her a ride, knocked her unconscious, took her to his apartment where he raped her, tortured her, and stabbed her repeatedly. Then he delivered the final blow to her skull. He wrapped her body in anything he could find and dumped her haphazardly and ran over her body before dumping her. And you're probably wondering something that I wondered. That composite sketch, did it match Lucious Boyd? Well, the truth is, it didn't match Lucious Boyd. And that's probably one of the most frustrating, important parts of this case. The composite sketch came from the witness who claimed she saw him, and she gave a very detailed description. But at the time that Lucious Boyd was caught, he wasn't clean cut and he didn't have a mustache, so he didn't fit the description. That goes back to what I said earlier in the case. You can't go solely based on the composite sketch to catch the killer. In this case, there was an overabundance of evidence that pointed to Lucious Boyd. They didn't need that composite sketch. They had the missing Torx screwdriver. They also had the missing laundry bag that was found on Donna's body. They also had the tire tread marks that were matched by the church van and were found on the sheets. And they had the most important piece of evidence, DNA, that pointed to Lucious Boyd. In January of 2002, Lucious Boyd was convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to death. Investigators believe Dawnia was not his first victim. They were able to say that other women disappeared around him too. And for a long time, investigators were unable to link him to any of those disappearances because they did not have a body. But as of 2026, Lucious Boyd, already on death row for the 1998 murder of Dawnia DaCosta, is now facing prosecution in Broward County for the rape and murder of Eileen Trumpner, a case that has remained unsolved for decades. What's especially unsettling is the timing. Investigators say Trumpner was killed just weeks before Dawnia, placing both murders in the same narrow window in late 1998. In 2023, DNA Breakthrough didn't just identify a suspect, it connected two victims and raised the possibility that Boyd may be responsible for additional murders across South Florida, with detectives now actively reviewing unsolved cases from that same time period. And that's what makes this moment significant, because this wasn't about finding new evidence, it was about finally re-examining what had been there all along. For over 20 years, these cases existed in isolation, but once connected, they began to tell a different story, one that suggests a pattern, not coincidence, and one that leaves open the question of how many victims may still be waiting to be linked to Lucious Boyd. Takeaway. This case is a reminder that danger does not always speak from behind. It often happens in our normal moments. We've all been running late, leaving an event behind schedule, trying to get home, needing just a little bit of help. And when you're in those moments, what are you paying attention to? Are you present, or are you just trying to get through it? Because most of us aren't thinking something could go wrong. We're thinking, let me handle this and keep it moving. And that's real. But this case makes you pause. It shows how quickly an everyday moment, an unassuming interaction, can very quickly lead into danger if you meet the wrong person. So I'm not saying live in fear. We all know we cannot do that or we'll cease to live. That's not the takeaway, but I'm saying be more intentional about your awareness. Who's around you? Who's approaching you? What feels off? Even if you can't fully explain it. Do you trust yourself enough to listen to that feeling, or do you simply rationalize it away and say, no, I'm just feeling a little uncomfortable, but it's okay? And I also want to acknowledge this. We're not in the 90s anymore. We have more technology now, more ways to stay connected, more ways to protect ourselves. And maybe you're thinking, what happened to Danielle? Steph, that can't happen to me. I wouldn't be getting out my car, walking to the nearest gas station less than a mile away, not to get $1.76 worth of gas. My God, what a time to be alive. And I would believe you. I would say, yeah, you're probably right. More than likely in 2026, we wouldn't be doing that. Technology has helped us from doing some of the things that Anya could not avoid doing back in the 90s. Maybe you're sharing your location with someone you trust. Maybe you're on the phone while you walk if you have to. And maybe you're going to call roadside assistance instead of relying on whoever pulls up. Maybe you're taking the extra second to really look at who's approaching you. And all of those things, while important, they don't guarantee you safety. They give you options, but don't ensure that you'll make it home to see another day. Because it's not always about the situation itself. It's about how easily something normal, something familiar can be used against you. Kindness can be used against you, like it was with Nia's case. When she saw that church van pull up, she felt comfortable. Church, something that she saw refuge in, and her vulnerability was used against her. When I think about Donna, I don't just think about how her life ended. In her brief 21 years, her mother says that she changed everybody's life who she came in contact with. I wholeheartedly believe that. She had a glow about her, and I never even met her. So, in the spirit of Nia's legacy and the impact that she had in the brief years on this earth, let her story be a warning. We don't have to live in fear, but we do need to stay aware because not every situation is going to announce itself as dangerous. Sometimes it's normal, but trust your gut. Be safe. And remember, there is no such thing as being overly cautious. That marks the end of our episode, fam. If this case stayed with you or if something in this episode stuck out to you, don't just sit with it. Come and talk to me about it. Let's have a conversation, whether it's in the comments over on Instagram or Spotify. Join me on Substack if you want to go deeper. Either way, the key is don't keep it to yourself. Let's talk. A lot of you are already tapped into how we do things on Murder in the Black, but I realize we have several new followers and family that has joined the tribe. So let me give you a rundown on what you can expect from us every week. On Wednesdays, we drop Story Time with Steph, and we release that on all of our social media platforms. It's shorter cases, but the same depth, same vibes. Then you have a full episode that's released on Thursdays on Murder in the Black. And if you still want to join us for more, you are more than welcome to join our paid subscription, where we provide bonus episodes every Sunday. We want to remind you that you can enjoy our episodes and get visuals on YouTube and Spotify. And if you join the community over on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and smash that bell button so you can get updates every time we upload. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. I'll see you next week.